Hey folks, tonight's story is written by Denton Quick. Make sure to go check out his book, This Haunted Life on Amazon, a spine-chilling collection of short horror stories. A link will be in the description below. Thanks again to Denton Quick for this awesome story. I was in Madrid, Spain, when I got the call. My team was to report to our outpost in Barcelona, where we were briefed on a code red situation. In my unit, code red meant extremely urgent. We were a small group of psychopaths the US government utilized when something went so far off the rails that they could not be connected to it. Sometimes it meant someone had to die. Not always. We did a lot of unusual work, but a code red was almost always a wet operation. Wet in intel parlance meant bloody, because blood is wet. We were not officially part of the military, nor any intel agency. I had no idea where our money came from, and I didn't ask. I do know that some intel agency of the US government was giving the orders, but I had no names at all in case things went sideways. All 5 of us were recruited from the Army or Marines. At some point, we were identified as candidates for this outfit and approached unofficially by a contact who never identified themselves. If we agreed, we soon got honorably discharged from the military and offered a job with some cutout company who supposedly give tours to tourists to various places around the world. Our paycheck come from them, but we all knew it was coming from the government. My team consisted of the following: myself, a former Marine, sharpshooter, an expert at demolitions and hand-to-hand combat. They call me Bulldog Malone. I'm the commander of this unit. Then, we had the Twisted Twins, Kyle and Corey. These guys are expert snipers and hackers. We also had a guy named Tyrone, but we called him Crusher. He was like the Hulk, could crush a man in his arms. I saw him take a wild boar the size of a small sofa down with his bare hands once. Last but not least was Ortega. She was the only female on the team, but she was insane. She specialized in poison, manipulation, lockpicking, small arms, sabotage, and booby traps. All of us were lethal, and none of us had a conscience. We met our contact Sam at a hole-in-the-wall pub in Barcelona. We followed him back to a small villa on the beach where he gave us our mission and laid out the facts. He told us that there was a rogue Navy SEAL from a secret reconnaissance mission team who was on a killing spree across Europe. Interpol had been briefed and they were on the case, but there were a few details they left out when apprising them of the situation. The SEAL was supposedly under the control of some kind of parasitic octopus-like creature that the team had encountered on a mission. This creature, unknown to modern science, had killed 5 SEALs and sunk their boat while attaching itself to one SEAL who seemed to be being used by it against his will. The 2 had last been identified in Barcelona. Sam produced copies of a number of photos and police reports detailing the crime scenes. He had translated them in English for us so we could read them ourselves. We passed them around, and Sam waited while we all read the reports in their entirety and studied the photos. I'd never seen anything like this before. Each body had the same pattern of injury. There were 2 deep puncture wounds in the chest. Several of these went all the way through the torso and out the back. The bodies were all drained of nearly all blood, and each corpse had its head removed by what appeared to be both lacerations and a twisting action of extreme force. A substance similar to the saliva of a Komodo dragon was found on the heads. This was a clear slime that contained a flesh-eating bacteria. When we were finished, I asked Sam if this was some kind of test or a joke. Such a creature surely could not exist. He then showed us photographs that had been recovered from a small camera the SEAL team had dropped at the time of their attack. It was unimaginable. The photos showed this black octopus-looking creature holding a Navy SEAL up with 2 of its tentacles while biting his head off. They appeared to be inside some kind of cavern. There was a pool of water the thing supposedly had come out of. Its eyes were a deep gold color and very large. It had a huge mouth, which was situated not on its underside like a normal octopus, but on the side above where the tentacles start, right under the eyes. He also showed us a clip from a security camera that was on the boat the SEALs had used. They recovered the file from the camera when they salvaged the boat at the bottom of the sea. The footage showed black tentacles reaching up over the side of the boat and retrieving a motorized raft that the seals kept inflated and ready to be used in case of emergencies. Then, about 10 minutes later, you could see the raft heading off towards shore with the creature in it. They zoomed in, and you could see the thing was clinging to the upper back of a man in a wetsuit. He told us the SEAL team on the boat had all survived, but the other SEAL and the creature were too far away to be stopped. He also said that he wasn't authorized to tell us any more about their mission, as the location of the attack and the purpose of their mission were too highly classified. He did say the SEAL's name was Captain Riley Hamill, age 32, expert at reconnaissance, geology, and marine biology. He was still a Navy SEAL, so he was extremely dangerous and very capable of defending himself. They did not know to what degree he was in control of himself, and to what degree the creature was controlling him. I told him I didn't think the SEAL's ranks went up past lieutenant. He informed me that these guys were special SEALs and that each one had their own staff who did not go in the field with them on missions but acted as support. I'd never heard of that, but I took his word for it. He handed me a cell phone and told me that any new information Interpol acquired or any local authorities anywhere reported on similar killings, he'd send to the phone as soon as possible. There was an emergency number already in the contact list in the phone in case we needed anything. The mission was simple: kill the damn thing and then bring its remains back. If we had to kill Captain Hamill in the process, then we should not hesitate. We were to consider him as much a threat as the creature. He then informed us that we had been given full access to the crime scenes in case we wanted to examine them. We did so. The scenes were all the same. He appeared to have hidden in small alleyways with no security cameras in view and grabbed some passerby, dragging them into the alley. No one in the area heard anything. None of the street cameras recorded anyone in the area before or after who matched the description of Captain Riley Hamill. All we knew was his method of operation and that he only killed at night. We all agreed that he had probably left the area to let the trail run cold. We were looking for another coastal town with small alleyways where he could use the same method, but at that point in time, no new reports of similar killings had come in. We didn't like waiting around for someone else to be killed, so we decided to split up and spend the night walking around Barcelona, imagining that we were his victim, or that we were him. If he went to a similar town with a similar layout, we would already be familiar with the way these towns are set up. We could better assess what his options would be to get in and make his getaway. We met for lunch the next day after getting some sleep and devised a strategy for how to catch him. First, we acted on the assumption that he would kill more than one in the next town. Once he kills again, we'd be alerted and know where he was. If he moved on before killing again, we'd miss him, but it's all we had to go on. Ortega was reading up on octopuses while we ate in case there was some similarity they shared with the creature that might give us some kind of advantage. She said they're carnivores who eat fish, crab, and other shellfish. She suggested that we use a crate of seafood as bait. Even though it seemed to be feeding on humans, it might not pass up the chance to eat a crate of fresh fish. We charted their path on a map by date and location. The first murder of this kind reported was in Lübeck, Germany, and then Hamburg. Then he moved southwest to Forbach, France, where he made his first mistake. He killed near a train station. We knew he was using trains. He also came from the Baltic Sea, since the first kill was literally on the coast of that body of water. He entered France between Switzerland and Luxembourg, presumably to limit the number of national borders to have to deal with. The next killing reported that per the same MO was in Lyon, France, and then Marseille. Then he hit Montpellier and St. Mary, France. He was moving south at that point along the coast. We had no reason to think he'd not continue southward, hugging the coast. Likely, the creature needed to get into water on a regular basis. They had to have hit it for the Mediterranean on purpose. We assumed they'd taken a train towards Valencia, but this guy was a SEAL, not a dummy. He'd know we were looking for him by then, so he might break pattern to throw us off. So we waited. We studied the coastal towns of Spain in the meantime to familiarize ourselves with potential environments we might have to operate in. Then, the call came. Ibiza. He'd hit an island. We booked a charter flight and were in the air within 2 hours. By the time we landed, it was midnight. The murder had taken place just after sundown at 7 p.m. The local police were told to show us the scene and not ask questions. There were bumped heads with Interpol who were angry and confused as to who we were and why we were being given precedence over the evidence and crime scene. We opted not to talk to them at all and let their superiors handle it. I kept hoping Riley would leave some kind of sign for us without the creature knowing. A clue, anything. We were mere hours behind them, but which way did they go? But the crime scene contained nothing new. As we were leaving, Ortega pointed out that they had continued moving south. Even though they did head out into the water this time, she asked if their goal was just to get to the sea, and they only broke their pattern by leaving the coast to throw us off of their trail. Then, why not go north also? There are a number of islands northeast of Barcelona. They're farther away, but if anyone was on the run, and they certainly knew they were, then their pursuers would likely not have seen that coming for sure. Instead, they'd stayed relatively near and let us get only a few hours behind them. Why? Could it be, she asked, that they weren't just hunting, but were going somewhere specific? The Twisted Twins were on their computers, checking the flight logs and cameras from the airport and passenger ships. How did they get to Ibiza, and how are they getting off? We used our contact to have the authorities check as much of the coast as they could for small boats that may have made landfall on beaches or other unusual and out-of-the-way spots, and to check all outgoing ships. We wanted to try to avoid public knowledge of the matter, but we were considering issuing a manhunt across the region for Captain Hamill, which would necessitate sending his photo to the police across Spain and the Mediterranean. The US government wanted to keep this thing quiet, so we had been avoiding doing that up to now. Then, the phone dinged. The text read that a taxi driver had reported finding some blood smeared on the back seat of his cab after letting a passenger off. The man, he said, smelled so bad that he had to open the window while he was driving. He wore a large black trench coat. The cab took him from the city and dropped him off at Cala Lantresca about 2 hours earlier. We checked the location out on satellite images online, and there was the perfect place for him to come in on a small boat and hide out unnoticed. Cala Lantresca was a very small community on the southwest part of the island. It was only 10 miles from our location. It sat at the top of a small oceanside mountain, the base of which was home to an inlet and a small sandy beach. Surrounding the inlet, the island formed high bluffs on all sides except the one facing the water, perfectly set up for snipers. At the back of the beach, there were a row of shanties, probably used by fishermen to temporarily store their equipment or beachgoers who wanted to get out of the sun. He could sleep in one of those unnoticed by night without anyone noticing. We were sure we'd found them. As we drove to the village, we formulated our strategy. We'd place 2 snipers at the top of the cliffs on either side of the inlet, facing back towards the beach and shanties. These would be the Twisted Twins, who were our best shots. Crusher would come down the footpath to the beach that the public used and search for Riley's boat. If he had one there, he'd conduct a search of the boat, killing Riley and the creature if he found them. Meanwhile, Ortega and I would take an inflatable motorboat into the inlet, checking each shanty with our scopes, all of which had large openings in the front instead of doors. If we saw them, we'd snipe them. If not, we'd roll up on the beach and do more thorough search of the shanties. We had them surrounded basically. This was going to be a turkey shoot. Ortega and I got dropped off about a mile up the coast and took the inflatable down to the waterline and began to inflate it. By the time we were heading into the inlet, the other men would be in place. Our scopes were equipped with thermal sensors, and so we'd know if they were visible inside any of the shanties, unless they were up against the inside walls on either side of the doorways. We were running silent in case he was monitoring communications. He was, after all, a Navy SEAL, and we expected him to be a notch up from the average target in terms of situational awareness. Within a half hour, we were approaching the beach. I scanned the shanties through my scope and didn't see any heat signature to indicate the presence of a person. The creature was most likely cold-blooded, so its body temp would be the same as the surrounding atmosphere. That would make it harder to see with thermal imaging. But our scope optics were actually a mixture of visible light, infrared, thermal, and night vision, so we'd still see it if it was in sight. The sun was coming up, and we noticed a small boat sitting to the right side of the beach. It was anchored and looked like it had also been run up onto the sand under the surface. Crusher saw it too. We noticed him enter the water from the foliage to the right. He swam out to the boat and hoisted himself over the rail and onto the deck of the boat. If Riley and the creature were inside, Crusher would kill them in short order. I kept an eye on the boat with one hand on the motor, but Ortega was busy checking out the shanties and the surrounding vegetation. I glanced up at the tops of the cliffs on both sides. Not that I'd be able to see the twins, but just in case they were trying to signal us somehow. I saw nothing, but felt assured that they were in place and already providing cover for us, as well as for Crusher. The twins were also connected to a live feed of a geostationary satellite looking down on the site on their sat-linked laptops. They'd record the entire operation as it took place. We were about 200 feet from shore when the boat Crusher was in suddenly exploded. I felt the heat from the fireball on my face as the shockwave sent a heavy pulse pounding through my chest. Bits of flaming board and scrap rained down around us as our boat hit the sand and came to a stop. Ortega and I knew right away it had to have been sabotage. The boat was booby-trapped. Riley knew we were coming and we had stepped right into his snare. Right about then, a shot rang out and our inflatable started to deflate. Ortega hit it for one of the shanties and I followed. We had to get cover fast. Another shot echoed in the cove and a bullet grazed my Kevlar vest. Before we got up to the shanties, another shot barely missed Ortega's neck, leaving an inch-long burn tracked across her flesh. Once we were safely inside one of these, we pressed against the walls to stay out of view and started scanning the area outside to try to assess our situation. Later, I'd see the recorded live sat feed of the area. Right after the boat exploded, you could see Riley just appear out of the bushes behind Corey and sneak up on him. He slit his throat and then picked up his rifle. Corey never even heard him coming. Across the lagoon, at exactly the same time, Karl seemed to have heard something behind him. He turned to look back from his prone position in his sniper nest while reaching for a throwing knife from his chest bandolier. But before he could retrieve it, the creature pounced on him, coming from seemingly nowhere. It leapt onto his back and seemed to be sucking on his head while bobbing up and down. Karl's arms were being held straight outward by two of the monster's tentacles, apparently to prevent them from stabbing the creature while it killed them. A few moments later, the thing crawled off of him and slid over the edge down towards the water. It left Karl's decapitated head next to his lifeless body. Since the two were separated and Riley was working with the creature, I assumed that it was no longer necessary for the creature to remain attached to him to maintain control over Riley's mind, if it ever was to begin with. I'd never gone up against a Navy SEAL before, much less one who had the assistance of a monster. I was humbled by the killing of 3/5 of my team in a single moment, the disabling of our inflatable, 2 shots at us, both making contact, and how it used our attack to turn us from the attacker into the trapped prey. I had no idea how Ortega and I were going to get out of this alive, much less kill the creature. As she swept her rifle across the view through the opening in the shanty looking for a target, Ortega told me her theory about this entire thing. It was so obvious that I was embarrassed I'd fallen for it. She said that there's no way he set this up in a couple of hours. The location was an obvious death trap for whoever was on the beach with high cliffs behind them as well as on both sides. We should have known he'd not stay there, giving himself hardly any path to escape if necessary. He chose the site for the purpose of trapping us. To make that work, he needed to bait us into coming to Ibiza. The killing was so he could wait nearby and watch to see who responded other than the traditional authorities. A Navy SEAL is smarter than to leave a bloodstain on the seat of his cap. He baited us, and we took the bait. I felt like a fool. I was considered the best, and I fell for a trap and lost 3 good men. There we were trapped in a shanty on a secluded beach in a small cove, sitting ducks. I tried to use the cell phone I'd been given to call for support, but there was no signal. He was probably jamming us. Ortega removed her MiG ballistic helmet and held it at the opening to the shanty on the end of a rifle. It was just near enough to be visible to someone outside, but not far enough out the doorway for anyone to tell that it was just a ploy. Sure enough, a shot rang out and a bullet hammered the bulletproof shell, knocking it off the rifle end. Then, something moved outside, and Ortega reflexively fired a round. Then nothing. We didn't see anything where she had fired. Then a branch moved on a tree at the edge of the shore. Another round. Again, no one there. Yet, again some movement in some bushes up on the cliffside. Only this time, as she fired, we saw a small stone bounce off the trunk of the bush and off onto the sand. I told her to hold her fire and that he was trying to get us to waste our ammo. I wasn't used to this. This guy fought with his brain. He could do anything with us huddled in there. The scenarios ran through my head. He could light the shanty on fire, forcing us out into the open where he could pick us off from a concealed position higher up. He could lob a grenade into the shanty. He could simply open fire on the structure and riddle it with bullets until the flimsy construction collapsed. The only thing he couldn't do was come at us head-on, where we could take him down as soon as he was in our sights. I realized that we had to get out of there. The longer we stayed, the worse our chances of survival. Surely he was using this time to plan and prepare his next move. The shanty was secured deep into the sand with locks that made up the basic frame, so we couldn't tip it over to one side or move it from within. Then, the stones started again. One would hit the rocky cliff face. A minute later, one would hit the water, then the sand, then a tree. A few even hit the roof and side of the shanty. Was he just terrorizing us? We stayed huddled down in there, making sure to stay alert. In the distance, we heard sirens and fire truck horns. Someone had heard the blast and seen the smoke from the boat. We tried to warn the firemen and police from where we were, shouting for them to stay back and that there was a sniper. They couldn't make out what we were saying, but some police came over to see what we were doing. None of them got shot. Within a few hours, we were out of there after convincing the police to escort us out, wrapped in a large Kevlar blanket that most police departments have on hand for emergencies. By the end of the day, we'd made our call and gotten ourselves cleared and even acquired the full support of the local police on orders from the government there. They searched the hillsides while Ortega and I processed the sniper nests. The police found an automatic pitching machine loaded with small stones instead of baseballs, positioned not far up on the side of the cliff nearest the shanty we had been inside. He was buying time to escape, not waiting to shoot us. Riley had made a fool of me again. But why not kill us? Ortega said he was just slowing us down. He knew we'd have to fill out reports and deal with our debt. He was buying time. I assumed he was aware of the nature of the satellite imaging in use since he was a Navy SEAL. He'd have to avoid that, but surely he knew we'd be able to see him leave the scene and perhaps track him. Upon checking the footage, we saw him and the creature enter a small submersible that appears to have been waiting for him on the other side of the cliff. A search of police records revealed that such a watercraft had been stolen merely days ago by a team working on a documentary off the coast of mainland Spain. They also found a police report of a sporting goods store in Ibiza that had been broken into the previous evening. The only thing stolen was an automatic pitching machine. Damn, this guy was good. But where was he going? My contact went so far as to ask the Navy to have all ships and submarines in the area conduct a search for the tiny sub. The only results were a single anomalous ping the next day off the coast of Libya. They put us up in a hotel on Ibiza and sent the surviving half of Riley's SEAL team to meet us. There were 6 of them, and they were the group's fire team. They'd be joining us to go after Riley and the creature. They wanted revenge, and I need men with equal or better skills as the man I was after. Ortega and I were cleared for access to information about the SEAL team's original mission. And when the men showed up, we exchanged information so everyone knew as much as each other about the situation. We had a few working theories between us, one of which was that the creature appeared to have human-level intelligence. What if the monster wasn't just looking for prey, but was traveling to a specific location for a specific reason? It could find prey anywhere in the water, even human beings at various beaches, so it didn't need Riley for that. So why keep him around? The only thing Riley could do that the creature couldn't was to cross difficult terrain. That sonar ping was off the coast of North Africa. Could this octopus be headed for the desert? A few days later, we got a call that 2 men had been found dead in Morocco. Both bodies were drained of all blood and had puncture wounds in the upper torso. Both bodies had been decapitated in the same manner as the other killings. The SEAL team's plane was waiting for us at the airport in Ibiza, fueled and ready to go. It was time to hit the desert, It was time to get some payback. I'd never seen anything like it. My taxi pulled up at the Ibiza airport and was directed to a private boarding area where a SEAL team's plane was waiting. There was a standard C-130 and its cargo bay was being loaded. But what surprised me was the set of vehicles and staff around it. Each SEAL was standing near a different van with a clipboard and was busy talking to their subordinates. All kinds of gear was being loaded onto the plane. It looked like they were preparing for war. I was used to operating quietly without fanfare so as not to draw any unwanted attention, but these guys were having none of that. I was with my teammate Ortega. She and I were chasing a rogue Navy SEAL named Riley Hamo. He was traveling with an octopus-like creature whom had taken control of his mind and led him on a killing spree. We were mercenaries working unofficially for some US intel agency, but had just been reassigned to continue our mission with a secret SEAL team. These guys were special, we were told. The cab led us out near one of the vans, and the closest SEAL noticed us and interrupted his conversation to greet us. He handed me a laminated ID badge on a lanyard to hang around my neck. It said Bulldog Malone on it and had my picture. There was one for Ortega as well. Hardly covert, I thought. He had one himself, and from that and his name patch, I could tell his name was O'Bannon. I already met him and the others back at the hotel, but we were about to get to know each other much better. He informed me that the badges were mainly for the staff, as they didn't stay attached to their unit for very long, and many were not in uniform. That way, the team knew their name right away and didn't have to waste time asking. Since Ortega and I were only temporarily attached to their team, we needed identifying name tags. Of course, the badges also had our clearance level on them. The staff for each SEAL were compartmentalized, and most never even find out what the mission was. It was all on a need-to-know basis. O'Bannon took Ortega and myself into the back of the black van that was sitting there and closed the door. It was quieter in there, so we could talk. As we got in, we were each handed a cup of hot coffee. I was about to tell the young woman who handed it to me how much sugar I took, but she told me instead, 2 teaspoons and tons of cream, slightly cooled so I don't burn my tongue. I looked at her confused, but she just smiled and told me they know everything about me. O'Bannon sat down and began to brief us on the current intel regarding the mission. He said the submersible they were in was found abandoned off the coast of Morocco. It was just north of the airport there at El Hoceima. That would be our first stop. He explained that the same day the sub was found, an airplane was stolen. It was a smaller plane, but it was fully fueled. The transponder was shut off right after takeoff, and it was flying below radar. That was our man. They did determine it had hit it due south, right into the Sahara Desert. I told him he was probably just trying to lose us. I mean, that's a big empty expanse of sand. We'd never find him in there. He smiled. Then, he opened a briefcase and took out some photos and handed them to me and Ortega. They were pictures of the cave the creature was found in. He said they'd gone back in there and finished their mission. There weren't any more creatures in there, but they did find a room in the rear of the cave that had all kinds of interesting things in it. O'Reilly didn't make it that far back, so he never saw this stuff. He pointed to one of the photos in my hand. It was a picture of an engraving in stone. It was a large dot surrounded by concentric circles. There seemed to be a mountain range above it on the top. There were depictions of ships and men between the rings, with octopuses attacking them. Then he told me that they figured out where Riley was going. He explained that his staff had identified the location of the landform in the engraving. It's a place in the country of Mauritania called the Rishat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara. It was dry now, but he said the engraving clearly shows water between the rings. What he said next left my jaw gaping open. He said, there is strong evidence that this place is the remains of what we today call Atlantis. He said that the SEALs had determined that the creature had human-level intelligence, not only due to its ability to control Riley, but also because Riley was unaware of the engraving, and yet here he was, taking the octopus right to it. Therefore, the creature itself knew what it was and how to get there. The engraving showed octopuses in the water, so the creature was almost certainly from there originally. It's going home, I thought. Ortega pointed out that the thing is going to be sorely disappointed when it finds out that there's no longer any water there or anywhere else within hundreds of miles. And any city of Atlantis that was there at some point in the past is long gone now, leaving no trace of itself or evidence that it had ever existed in the first place. Still, at least we knew where he was going. However, the structure is a circle with a diameter of 25 miles. That's a lot of ground to cover. The seals didn't operate in the desert very often, unless it was right up against a body of water. But they knew Riley very well, having worked with him for years, and it was thought this would give them an advantage over other teams. They put us with them because we had experience fighting him. O'Bannon said the military had satellites and a drone scanning the area in and around the structure trying to find the plane. If they found anything, they'd send it to us right away. We were going to land on the thing. They'd identified a few spots that were flat and long enough where the ground was clear and hard enough for that to work. There were desert-capable, all-terrain vehicles in the plane that we'd use to take the rest of the way once we had our coordinates. If they found the plane before we got there and we couldn't land nearby, we'd roll right out of the back of the plane mid-flight in the vehicles, which were equipped with their own parachutes. The military had changed their mind and now wanted them both alive if possible. But Ortega and I, along with the SEAL team, all wanted the creature dead. Riley had been part of their team, so they were hoping not to have to kill him. But if that wasn't possible, they were just as willing as we were to take him down. There would be a medical team right behind us, along with some select members of their staff. They'd keep their distance, but would be ready and waiting for our call, should we need them. O'Bannon's staff had loaded our gear onto their plane and finished prepping it for takeoff. Everyone else was already on board and waiting for us, so we got out of the van and boarded the plane. Next stop, Morocco. As we flew over the Mediterranean Sea, we were given a brief rundown of the team. They had 2 snipers, Henderson and Marks. They had a demolitions guy named Rusty, 1 heavy machine gunner named Bristol, and 2 point men, O'Bannon and Malloy. Technically, all these guys could do all these jobs nearly equally well, but these were their preferred roles when they acted as a team. All of these men had survived the creature and Riley sinking their boat with them in it in the Baltic Sea. They had been humiliated by the rogue captain and the creature just as Ortega and myself had been. They had also lost the entire recon team to them, and they were itching to get even. They explained that they were going in hard and heavy. There would be no trickery this time. A few hours later, we landed in Morocco at the El Hoceima airport, which was right on the water's edge. The sub had made it about 500 miles. No doubt the batteries had given out and Riley had to abandon it. After landing, we were met by a local police officer. He seemed to be someone of high rank. He took us by van to a nearby beach called Playa del Suani. Once there, we would see the submersible. He had run it up on the sand as far as he could. The police had found it and pulled it the rest of the way out of the water with the help of a tow truck. It was being held in an upright position by the winch of the truck so we could get in there and look for clues. Ortega and I went in first. The interior had a strong fishy smell to it. She got a UV light out and began to look for traces of various substances. Meanwhile, I checked the battery level indicator and of course, they were nearly depleted. I noticed a small locket on a thin necklace chain on the floor. I picked it up and opened it. It was a small photograph of a woman. I'd guessed that it had been taken in the 1970s from the looks of her hairstyle. I assumed it was most likely Riley's mother. If it had belonged to the crew of the sub before he stole it, it would be unlikely they'd have dropped it in here by mistake. The fact that Riley dropped it indicated to me that he had psychologically left his past behind and was now completely dedicated to doing the will of the creature. Ortega found some dark blue goo on the floorboard and collected it in a small vial. She said she suspected it was octopus blood that had begun to dry out. The thing had been injured by Riley's rock pick in the Baltic and hadn't completely healed yet. The SEALs gave the sub a once-over themselves. We showed them our findings. And O'Bannon informed me that yes, that was Riley's necklace. He wore it all the time. They had also discovered that the vessel's communications and location beacon had been disabled. Riley was no fool. Before heading back to the base, the police introduced us to a man who witnessed the 2 killings that had taken place on the beach. He gave us a copy of the man's written testimony. It had already been transcribed into English for us. Here is what it said. It was late, and I went with 2 friends of mine, Abdul and Karim. We were going to take some pictures of the stars. When we got there, we saw a small submarine, the kind that only fits a few people, the ones scientists use to photograph the ocean floor. It was beached in the surf. There was no one around, and I had to urinate, so I headed back westward along the beach to find a good spot. I was almost done when I heard Abdul screaming. I turned to look, and in the dark, I could make out the silhouette of the sub with Karim standing in front of it. On top of it, I could see something moving. It was like long snakes writhing around. But it wasn't. I didn't know what it was. I started walking back towards them to help, but then I stopped when I saw what it was. The snakes were attached to something bigger. It was some kind of creature, and the snakes weren't snakes. They were tentacles. It stood up on the sub, and it looked like a man, but it had these tentacles coming off of it all around its upper body. Then, the thing jumped through the air and right onto Karim's head. When it did, the man part stayed on the submarine. That's when I realized it was not one creature, but it was a creature that had been on the man. It was on his back. About 10 seconds later, I saw Karim's body drop to the ground, and the thing started to crawl back to the sub where the man was. He was climbing down to where it was then. I ran back towards the road that goes to the airport. That's where we had parked. I got in my car and went right to the police station. We all read the report, and the SEALs questioned the man in greater detail. After a while, we packed up and headed back to the airport. The SEAL staff and medical crew had landed, and we were eager to give them the sample Ortega had found. We met with O'Bannon's staff and gave them our information along with the sample. Ortega was conversing at length with a woman on his staff who wore civilian clothes and kept nodding as she talked to her. If I knew Ortega, she was working on a different angle somehow. She did this often. We'd have one plan. She'd modify it in case something went wrong, and have some surprise to pull out of her bag of tricks at the last minute. She didn't like to share her secondary hypothesis with anyone, because it's often incomplete and a long shot. But she had peeled my ass out of so many sticky situations this way in the past, so I didn't interfere. We boarded the plane and headed for the reshot structure. We had full cooperation of the countries we need to fly in, as well as any support we may need from their militaries. They were apprised of the situation and wanted this thing dead as much as we did. On the way, I noticed Ortega fooling around in a gear case with something. I'd seen the woman she was talking to give her the case back at the airport after going into the medical plane and retrieving it. About an hour into the flight, Ortega got a call over the radio from the medical plane behind us. They had positively identified the blue goo as coagulated octopus blood. Ortega briefed myself and the SEALs about it. She said octopuses are cold-blooded creatures. Their body temperature is always the same as the surrounding environment. Due to this, they needed a more robust form of oxygen transportation in the blood than our iron-based hemoglobin. Where we used iron in our blood to bind the oxygen, they use copper. This gives their blood its blue color. She opened up a supply case she'd brought and showed us. It was full of fish on ice. She explained that octopuses eat fish and other marine life. We could use the fish as bait, and if it worked, she had a surprise for the creature. Inside each fish's mouth, she had placed a vial of some reddish fluid. She told us it was an iron solution. When iron gets into the blood of an octopus in heavy doses, it impeded the copper from binding to oxygen, and the creature suffocates and dies. She had the medical staff whip it up for her in the medical plane's onboard lab. She said the concentration of iron was so high in these that one fish should be enough to kill the beast. The SEALs looked impressed. O'Bannon said, if we need it, fine, but he's relying on his sidearm. We all had a good chuckle. We slept on the plane, woke early, and had our MRE breakfast. Everyone was packing their equipment with whatever they thought they might need in the field. The desert buggies were packed, gassed up, and ready to go. We were all ready to land as the sun came up over the Sahara. O'Bannon got a call on his radio. The drone had spotted the plane. They gave him the coordinates, which he relayed to the pilot. Word came back that we were about an hour away from the drop zone. O'Bannon laid a topographic map out on a crate in front of us and plotted the location of the plane with a pen. He also drew a dot where we were going to drop. He marked the location where the plane will land to wait for us. It was about 5 miles northeast of our drop location. The medical plane would land another few miles east of that at another area they determined was flat and clear enough of rocks for it to safely touch down. Soon enough, we were approaching our target, and so we all strapped into our seats. We were taking 2 desert buggies with 4 of us in each and a bunch of gear stowed in back and on top. We each had 2-way radios all tuned into a common channel. These were headsets with small microphones and earpieces. Ortega and I were to use total radio silence, but I didn't mind the change. It had come in handy on this mission. The cargo door on the back of the plane opened, and one at a time, we literally drove right out of the back into freefall. The parachutes had tiny rockets on them for near instant opening, so the fall was only about 10 seconds before the chute slowed our descent, and the uneasiness in my gut could return to normal. We landed with one hell of a thud while the shocks and springs on the vehicle bounded us around for another 20 seconds. O'Bannon laughed, and we all howled at the sensation of doing something so insane and surviving. "Just another day at the office," he said. We soon got our bearings and hit it off across the sand towards the location where the stolen plane had been spotted. As we drove, O'Bannon and Ortega used special military binoculars to scan the terrain ahead and to the sides. These had optics in them that could differentiate a human body from the sand and rock around it and highlight it in the view field with a flashing blue color. It also would sound a high-pitched tone if any such human or animal entered the viewfinder. We didn't want any surprises and fully expected an ambush. The other SEAL was driving, and I was manning the gun. I felt like sniper bait up there, but I had a bulletproof vest and helmet on, and we were moving, so I'd make a tough target to kill. Even so, this guy was a SEAL and an expert marksman, so I was slightly nervous anyway. The plane had been spotted in a valley between 2 of the rings, which themselves were just circular mountain ranges with flattened tops. It was believed that these ring mountains were formed from volcanic upwelling and geothermal heating of the surface about 99 million years ago. Because of this, the ground was a little smoother than you'd expect. We had to drive down the side to get to our target, and a nearby sandy slope had been identified as the place to do it. We descended down it at about a 40-degree angle. It'll be fun getting back up, I thought. At the bottom was a flat channel that was obviously a dried-up waterway. More evidence that this was in fact the lost city of Atlantis. We drove another few miles when O'Bannon came over the radio, informing us that we were approaching the plane to our left. He'd landed down there in the valley. I saw a glint from the windshield glass and informed everyone where the plane was. We slowed down at about 500 feet, stopped, parked, and exited the vehicle. We weren't going to let Riley and the creature walk us into a trap like they had before. 2 SEALs took the high road, climbing over rocks to come down onto the plane's position. 2 SEALs approached head-on. 2 more stayed back and perched themselves up onto a couple of outcrops and set their sniper rifles up. They started scanning the area in their scopes for movement. Ortega and I ran across the valley and proceeded around the channel, following the circular path it made. We were going to approach the plane from the other side. When everyone was in position, about 200 feet from the plane in all directions, O'Bannon flew a small remote-controlled drone up to hover over the plane with its camera facing downward while he observed the view on a small monitor. We each scanned the scene from our various vantage points, and all reported back no sign of Riley or the creature. Slowly, we moved inward a few feet at a time, stopping to look again and reassess the situation. The plane was stopped in front of a chasm in the rock to the east of it. It looked like there was enough room to walk back there. It was almost reminiscent of an alleyway in its size. We got a little closer, and I could see there were tracks in the packed sand pathway leading up a small embankment from the plane to the entrance of the chasm. They were in there. The 2 SEALs who had taken the high road stated they'd move along the top of the chasm since they were already up there and aim downward inside it to provide cover for the rest of us. O'Bannon and his wingman arrived at the plane first. He checked out the inside and reported nothing unusual about it, other than the same fishy smell which the creature had left in the sup. The plane's number matched the missing plane as well. We had the right aircraft. This was not a misidentification. The two snipers remained out by the plane, while Ortega and I proceeded into the chasm along with O'Bannon and his teammate, Malloy. We all had our guns drawn, except Ortega, who was lugging the case of fish along with some other gear. Malloy had a heavy machine gun, I had a grenade launcher affixed to my M16, and O'Bannon had a souped-up M4 SOCOM with laser sight and adjustable scope. If she needed them, Ortega had two nice 6-hour MPX carbines strapped to her back. We were ready to lay down some lead. The chasm was about 10 feet wide, and the sights went up somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 feet. Looking up, I could see the clear blue sky and our teammates up there looking forwards for us and behind, scanning the chasm below for any sign of our targets. They radioed to us before we got to every turn in the path to let us know it was clear ahead. The sand was matted down at that point, and so the tracks Riley had left were fairly clear. Occasionally, there were additional markings which seemed to be from the creature. One of our boys above radioed down that he was going to scout up ahead and follow the tracks from up there. We agreed. We pressed on, and after about 10 minutes of walking, our scout reported back that the tracks had turned and entered the side of the chasm through an archway. The door was constructed out of stone block. I wondered how such a feature had gone unnoticed by geologists when they surveyed the area. Surely, they had conducted a thorough ground mapping of this place. On the other hand, the chasm is small, and the entire structure is 25 miles in diameter. It's the size of a large city. When we arrived at the archway, I volunteered to enter first. Peeking around the corner quickly, I could tell that it was the entrance to a long hallway. The whole thing appeared to be made of standard sandstone. There were no markings on the walls or entrance. We proceeded down the hallway. It was dark, but we didn't want to alert them to our presence, so we kept lights out and turned on our night vision. These were passive night vision optics, no infrared illuminators. The creature would see those as a bright light if we used them. Through the night vision, everything was a dull green. There were green speckles in the display that constantly and randomly appeared across the image, giving it a sort of static-like appearance. The floor was free of debris, and there didn't seem to be any life in there. There were no adjoining corridors, just that one long empty hallway. It was dark and getting darker the deeper we probed into the construction. The night vision relied on the ambient light and would not be able to show us anything if it got much darker. We stopped to listen. It was quiet. Each step reduced the slight scuffling sound of our feet on the stone floor. The passageway turned to our left. Another 100 feet or so, it started sloping downward. It descended at a mild angle for about 50 feet and then leveled out again. Just as we were about to have to turn on the infrared illuminators, the hallway began to get brighter. We stopped to listen, and there in the silence, we could hear something from up ahead in the darkness. It was a faint sound, but unmistakable. It was the sound of water sloshing. We pressed onward slowly. The night vision got brighter in our headsets until we could see our surroundings clearly. We came upon an opening in the side of the hallway. Inside was an underground cave. It had a low ceiling and a pool of water in the bottom. We were trying to remain quiet, so our radios were off. O'Bannon motioned us to stay back from the water. Through the night vision, the water was black, and anything could be just below the surface, and we wouldn't see it. There was a dim glow coming from the back of the cave to our left, and a stone walkway leading back there alongside the pool. Up ahead was more darkness, so O'Bannon motioned for us to head toward the source of the light. Along the walkway, there was natural rock to our left and the pool to our right. We rounded the bend at the rear of the small cave and saw the walkway led to another archway. Beyond it seemed to be a larger room, which was lit well enough for us to see without our night vision. We cautiously entered the room and removed our night vision goggles. The light was coming through a door in the far side of the room. The room itself was a perfect rectangle cut right out of the natural stone. There was enough light so we could see that the room was completely empty. We formed the line flat against the wall to the left of the door. O'Bannon used a small scope to peek around the entrance to the adjoining room where the light was coming from. A confused expression flashed across his face as he observed the small monitor it was attached to. He put the scope away and moved across the opening to the right side of the door. He motioned for me to have a look. I peeked into the room. It had a high ceiling, I'd say about 30 feet. There was a giant pool in there. Not a natural pool like the one in the cave, but a constructed pool. It was huge, several times that of a standard Olympic pool. The light was coming from under the water. On the far end, facing us, there was a round pillar that rose up about 10 feet into the air. Sitting on the pillar, cross-legged and shirtless, was Riley. It looked like he was meditating. I looked at O'Bannon and shook my head no. I motioned that we should shoot him. O'Bannon shook his head no. If he hadn't been a SEAL, he'd be dead already. My team was a wet team. The only thing I did was kill. I didn't try to talk to my target into surrendering. Frankly, neither did the SEALs. I used sign language to tell O'Bannon it was a trap. He shook his head yes. He motioned to Ortega with the number 6. This meant for her to watch our backs. That means to keep an eye on the other door to the room which led back to the cave. He then motioned for myself and Malloy to cover him from the doorway. We nodded in agreement. O'Bannon stood up and slowly entered the pool room. I took a kneeling position on the right side of the door, looking into the left, while Malloy laid prone in front of it with his support gun stand down on the floor, looking straight in and where he could see to the right. O'Bannon approached the water. Riley opened his eyes. I checked him out through my scope quickly. His face seemed to have the peeling skin like he was melting or had had a bad sunburn. O'Bannon called out to him and asked him if he was alright. He did not reply. Instead, a series of long white bristles rose up from his back like a cat getting frightened. They stood up like the static electric effect on hair would do. I motioned to Malloy to go into the room. He nodded. I wasn't about to let O'Bannon get his head chewed off just because he naively wanted to save his comrade. It was clear to me that Riley was gone. Whoever he was now, I didn't know, but this wasn't the same mind. I crossed the threshold into the room to the left of the door, and Malloy crossed to the right. We both scanned the room for any signs of the creature. We saw none. The walls in there were black and white granite, rough and bumpy in texture. The water was clear, and the pool was cut out of the same stone. There were some large rocks in the bottom of the pool along with some structures resembling coral. Under the water surface, there were several openings in the side of the pool, which were about the size of ventilation shafts. They were lit, as was the pool itself. I could not tell where the light was coming from in the pool, but it appeared to me to be electric. I could not see the creature in the water, but I was assuming it was there somewhere. O'Bannon started to walk around the pool to the right to approach the pillar. As he did, Riley stood up and leered at him. Malloy stood up and raised his gun in case he had to protect O'Bannon. He stepped forwards as he did so. I was watching Malloy walking forward with his gun pointed at Riley when I noticed something strange. The granite wall behind him started to move. It was moving in a fluid sort of fashion. Suddenly, it looked as if a piece of the wall bulged out and leapt off the wall and onto Malloy's back. It was the shape of an octopus. Its flesh changed colors from the black and white granite pattern to a deep red as its mouth opened and emitted a screeching scream. It raised 2 of its tentacles up above its head, at which point each one produced a long white pointed rod from within. I raised my weapon and took aim at the thing as it pierced Malloy's body with these rods, which thrust clear through him. The creature's gaping shark teeth-filled mouth clamped down onto Malloy's head and started to chew it off. I fired and riddled the thing's body with bullets, each one blasting a chunk out of the thing. Its blue blood splattered across the wall behind it, and it fell over along with Malloy's headless body. The creature's mouth gaped open as it died, revealing Malloy's decapitated head inside, which promptly rolled out onto the floor. Riley, upon seeing this, let out a similar screech as the creature, and as if in response to this, dozens of similar creatures inside the pool altered their natural camouflage from the granite pattern to various hues. black, red, and olive green mostly. These things then swam up and jumped out of the pool and began screeching and showing their teeth with their huge amber eyes, looking back and forth at me and O'Bannon. Screw this, I thought, as I took aim at Riley and fired. Red spots littered his chest as he slammed backwards and up against the far wall, before sliding down, leaving a streak of blood as he did. O'Bannon opened fire on the nearest monster, blasting it to pieces and sending chunks of rubbery flesh, wet with blue liquid, sprawling in all directions. The others roared with even more fury at this. There were at least 24 of these things out of the water at that point. We were outnumbered. We needed to leave. I shouted out to O'Bannon to retreat, but he couldn't hear me over the deafening machine gun rattle. I walked backwards towards the door while lobbing grenades at bunches of them, sending piles of them into a blasted seafood splatter. Ortega stepped into the room and dumped the open fish case over the floor, sending poison flounder delights spewing across the floor. She then opened fire with her 2 automatic pistol carbines. There were octopuses on the ceiling and walls crawling towards us like spiders. Her hail of bullets peppered through their puffy rubber limbs and hits, causing a series of mini explosions of sea meat to erupt around the room like liquid fireworks. We both got covered in bits of slimy octopus, dripping with blue and white goo. Meanwhile, O'Bannon was being lifted up into the air, impaled by 6 or more of those white spikes these things had in their tentacles. At least 3 of these things were stabbing him at once and letting his blood drain down off his wounds into their giant round mouths. I was about to put him out of his misery with a well-aimed bullet when the creatures literally tore him in half with their tentacles and started munching on his body. Ortega grabbed the back of my shirt as I kept firing and pulled me out of the door into the rectangular room. The monsters were moving slower now, but still headed our way. Just before I turned to run, I noticed that many of them had begun to eat the fish she had dumped onto the floor. I knew there was a reason I loved her so much. We got out into the small cave room and lit up our floodlights so we could run without tripping on anything. No need to be stealthy now, I thought. Ortega ran up ahead of me and asked me to hold him off at the door to the cave room. She reached the door that led to the hallway and started to rig it up with explosives. We were gonna try to trap them in there. I could see a few enter the rectangular room, headed our way. Several seemed to be sick and curled up still, while others kept getting closer. I guess not all of them had the fish for dinner. I laid down a sheet of lead, and a few of them took damage. I looked back at Ortega to see how the demolition charges were coming when a giant version of these things rose up out of the pool in the cave room. It was about the size of a large elephant. This one was nasty looking too. It had the same basic shape of the others, only it was an olive green in color. Its flesh was slimy and wrinkled. It also had long fleshy tendrils on either side of its mouth, drooping down like whiskers. It had those long white bristles all over its body, and a few huge feather-looking appendages on top of its head, which stood upright like the back of a swordfish. I opened fire on the bastard as it tried to poke me with one of those white spikes in its tentacles. It reeled back, and I lobbed a grenade deep into its growling mouth. I ran around the pool on the walkway as it exploded into a million gobs of fatty rubbery goo. I came around the bend as Ortega was finishing up. She pulled out a remote detonator and smiled. I glanced back and saw about 6 of them had now entered the cave. We both turned and exited the cave at the same time and ran right into Riley, who had somehow gotten out through some back way and came up the far end of the hallway through the dark. He caught us by surprise and somehow had all of our hands held tight while his hands were firmly grasping onto our necks. I looked down and saw that he had his own tentacles now protruding out of his sides, which he was now using to hold our hands so we couldn't shoot him. His face was grey now and wrinkled. His eyes had turned a dull yellow. He had a menacing grin on his face and was squeezing harder on our necks with each passing second. I managed to push a few words past his chokehold, telling him to look at my necklace. I had put his necklace on in case he was still somewhat coherent. I could only hope that some distant spark of memory remained within his mind, and whatever love he still had for his mother would be enough to stir some emotion within. He looked at it and recognized it. He removed his hand from my neck and held the locket in the palm of his hand. Ortega looked at me with wide eyes as her face started turning blue. I thought it was over, so I asked her to marry me. She nodded yes, as she started to pass out. Riley meantime opened the locket and saw the picture of his mother, his head cocked sideways as he studied it with curiosity. He loosened his grip on Ortega, and she took in a life-saving gush of oxygen. He remembered something. I don't know how much, but it had bought us enough time to catch our breath. Just then, I heard a loud, and Riley fell to the ground, his peachy and fleshy tentacles letting loose. We heard footsteps on the stone floor from up the corridor. A moment later, a seal named Rusty ran up to us and out of the dark. He had been one of the men providing cover for us when we were walking in the chasm. We quickly told him that Malloy and O'Bannon were dead, as was the creature, but that there were a whole bunch more on the way and we were about to blow the entrance to their lair. He nodded in agreement and turned to leave. We looked back and saw that several dozen of them were fast approaching the entrance to the cave. We ran up to the corridor a ways and turned to look back again. There were a horde of them about to enter the corridor, so Ortega used the remote detonator. The sound clicked off my hearing with a searing pain, like someone shoving ice picks into my ears. The shockwave threw us both to the ground, and everything went black. I woke, I don't know how long after, being pulled up by Rusty. I brushed the dust out of my hair and off my clothes, as did Ortega. She looked at me and smiled. Then she asked if I even had a ring. I checked my belongings, but all I had was that locket on the necklace, so I removed it from the thin chain, took out Riley's mother's picture, broke the lid off of it, and removed the backplate. This left a perfect bronze ring with some rather ornate reliefs of olive branches around the edge. I placed it on her ring finger, and she said she'll never take it off, as she laid a hard kiss right on my lips. We got back to the plane, dreading the process of having to write up our reports for this mission. I told Ortega that it was too bad we had to seal the place up. I bet there's a lot more to find down there. I wish we'd found some kind of blueprint for the facility. She smiled and pulled out her backpack. She opened it and removed a small flat tablet. It looked like it was made of the same granite the facility had been made of. She said she found it in the cave room when she was rigging the explosives. I took a look at the slab. It was a map of the reshot structure in its heyday, with dozens of locations depicted all across the face of the thing. We couldn't read the language, so we didn't know what was there at each location. But we both knew right then where we were going for our honeymoon. And we knew right where to dig.